There were several things that happened in my early life that attracted me to the Buddhist. One was the turnoff of Christianity, the abuse of Christianity. The second was my interest in martial arts in Japan. Third was a very vivid dream that I had when I was in university. There were several concepts in Buddhism that I found very interesting. One was the concept of karma, ending the endless cycle of karma, bad karma, or inen, as they say in Japanese. The second concept was improving yourself, your mind, your body, your spirit. In Japanese, they have an expression called minitsukeru, which really means to incorporate into your being. The other concept of Buddhism I found so interesting was the way that they use Zen meditation or koans or other activities to loosen up the mind in a world that can be so confusing and chaotic and programmed in the world such as the matrix we have today. The Buddhist gods were interesting to me. I found that Miroku Bosatsu, Amida Norai, Jizu, some of the older Shinto and Hindu crossovers like the Seven Gods of Luck, Ebisu, Jurojin, Fukuroji, Bishomon, Benzaiten, Daigokoten, Ebisu, and the many other crossovers they had from various religions dealing with Shintoism, Hinduism, Chinese Confucianism, and so on. They all used to have a great impact on the daily lives of people from those worlds, but have now lost their meaning, mostly because the matrix has shifted towards the dark side, and people today are dealing with other issues. What else I found interesting is the stark contrast for something like Thai Buddhism versus Japanese Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism is much more simple, whereas the Thai Buddhism is much more colorful. And both have their stories and both have their past. But unfortunately, like anything in the Matrix tends to have all these variations, just like they do in Christianity and other religions, that really have nothing to do with the truth, or the original meanings that have been distorted over time. And again, of course, the truth being whatever that is for the individual. But much of the stuff that I looked into was when I was traveling across Japan and Thailand and some of the other Buddhist countries, is that over time the meaning of their religion had been distorted by the Matrix to a point where they really didn't have much meaning anymore, or they had become cults. I also noticed when I went to certain temples, the more popular ones never seemed to have any spirits or energy. Some of the quaint, more quiet, out-of-the-way ones did. It seemed as though that the spirits of the past lingered in the places that were most sacred, that were most quiet, and less populated. While that wasn't always the case, it was generally the rule. If I go to a place and feel kind of empty and just kind of going through the motion, I know probably that Buddhist temple is more after its popularity, its finances, than actually practicing what they really used to believe. Of course, the Buddhists had their own hell and their own sins. The buttons you see on a bell or the prayer beads a Buddhist monk will hold represent one sin for each button or bead. There are a total of 108, representing the worldly temptations. A stark contrast to the 7 deadly sins that I grew up with Christianity in my childhood. Nonetheless, there are times that I went to some places that were so beautiful, so serene, so spiritually fulfilling, that I'll never forget them. I remember going up to one temple and having tea with a fellow teacher, actually he was the principal of the school that I worked at the time, because he was friends with the Buddhist monk that lived up in the mountains. So he drove me up there and we looked at the temple, and there was nothing but nature, some tea, a few sweets, and just the whole beauty of the land. And boy, that was really moving, to say the least. Now, for me as an individual, it would be impossible to give up the life that I had in order to become a Buddhist monk or something like this. There's just too many things in my psyche to surrender to such a lifestyle in my youth. Now I would love it, but in my youth it would be impossible. There were too many things for me to see and explore. On top of that, I later realized there was a couple of individuals I had to meet within the matrix to help end the karma that had been created many, many years ago. The dream that I had, as I mentioned earlier, was of me waking up in the samurai era, which shouldn't surprise anyone. I've been practicing martial arts all my life. But I woke up in the dream and I was walking with a friend, a fellow samurai, and we both were not armored. We just had the yukata and the hakama and our swords. And suddenly he turned at me as we were laughing and he cut me down. And as I died, the spirit pulled me out of my deceased body. I didn't feel any pain. I just shouted and then I was dead. And I later realized some of the mistakes that I had made that led up to that. So I went to a dojo with two people who were reincarnated from that lifetime, and we went through the whole scenario. That will take a complete other video to explain exactly what went down in order to see what happened in that life that influenced what happened in this life. However, the short version of it is somewhat simple. Basically, I went into a dojo that had these two individuals that were from that life. And their ancestors were telling me, because they knew that I could see and I could hear, and that the near-death experience, this is one of their requests, that they could see if I could undo what had been done in those days. And so we went through the whole motions and repeated almost exactly the same thing without the bloodshed, without the timeline. Of course, it's a modern timeline, but everything else was the same. And after a period of time, the ancestors showed up again and said, "There's no more you can do. You are free from this karma." And I left. The sad part is that both people that were of that karma were people that I were very fond of. But unfortunately, their sins, especially the sensei, the teacher of the dojo that I went to, was particularly corrupted by his ego, and it could not be undone. And unfortunately, he will fall forever, according to their ancestors. The other individual probably will stay within the matrix, repeating the same karma until he gets it, until he's ready to move on and leave the endless cycle of bad karma, which the last time I talked to him, he was having the same kind of troubles I did many years ago. And it was very heartbreaking for me to see, because I knew what he was heading for. So in the end, I find Buddhism something worth exploring. However, again, if you try to look into the religion through media or the like, you're likely to get a distorted view of what it's really all about. The near-death experience showed me that the Buddhists are very real, and that there are many paths you can take to reach the end of karma. The Buddhists showed me a lot of things. They showed me how people try to get away with cheating, lying, deceiving, in order to look good. And this is what Buddha had figured out, that all the material things in the world, well, they're nice to have and stuff, they really are about ego, trying to say that you're more than something than that you really are. It was particularly Miroko Bosatsu who had shown me this particular area. The Buddhists seem to not be so interested in helping other people in this world unless they're ready to leave it and enter their world. It's not that they are judgmental or anything like that. They just know perfectly well that if somebody's still struggling in the world of good versus evil, there's not a whole lot they can do until that individual is ready to leave it. But what I love about the Buddhists is that they have such a very different view of this world than the many other religions. They proverbs, their koans, and their other mental disciplines really give insight on how this world really works, as opposed to how the Matrix wants you to think it works. And that's what I find so fascinating about them. Their spiritual, physical, and mental practices I find also very appealing. While martial arts, for example, can be very competitive, as you get older, you begin to realize it's not about competition. It's not about winning or losing. It's just about meditating in the moment, practicing the martial art, well, of course, for self-defense in case you get into trouble, but actually for something more like it's meditation in motion, and as well as disciplining your physical body, at the same time mentally disciplining yourself. These are concepts I find very, very logical and very fulfilling in my way. I did Zen meditation for a long time, but I found that if I do martial arts, I can meditate and reach the same sort of consciousness without sitting for long periods of time, actually doing it in motion. And for me, that was much more suitable. I did go to one of the original Zen Buddhist temples in Niigata. Oddly, it was originally women only, very much like the Yuta-san in Okinawa, but later became men only when it became a Zen temple. The reason for this is probably because it was the end of the women's era and the beginning of the male ego's era that made the change. But specifically, I have not confirmed that. I probably should go back and find out the reasons why. But the Buddhists are not so interested in the male versus the female ego. They're very aware of both, and they can deal with both quite eloquently, though they are sometimes depicted as being somewhat androgynous. They do have their female goddesses. Benzaiten, or Benten as she's sometimes called, is actually originally a female goddess from the Hindu lore, Sahavatsi, I believe. And this is, again, the connection that Buddhists do so well. They can connect to the Hindus, they can connect to the Shinto, they can connect to pretty much any other religion. Because, again, what are they about? They're about peace, and their path to peace, and weaning themselves off of the chaos within the Matrix, which is, of course, specifically designed to be the way that it is, until you get tired of it and ready to move on. Unfortunately, we live in an age where we're being exposed to the people who just refuse to move on from the Matrix because they've become addicted to it. They get their privileged lives, their material things, and they seldom spiritually grow in any way and form. Eventually, some do figure out to let go of ego and begin to move on to something higher or something better. And Buddhism is only one of the many millions of paths that you can take, though I do find this one very, very comfortable to my own psyche. Of course, just like in Christianity, there are some things that I agree with that to me are spot on, and others not so much. And again, the more I look into it and the more I ask the ancestors and the like, the more I begin to realize is that, again, it was all because it was distorted. All because they took the meaning farther than it really was meant to be. The whole point of the path of the Buddhists was over control over your sins, control over your mind, control over your body, and not let the evil in the world destroy you. And I found their way to be very, very useful in many ways, whether you're still stuck in the Matrix or you actually are able to remove yourself from the Matrix. When you remove yourself from the Matrix, I met this one woman from Thailand who was Buddhist, and she wasn't pretentious about her religion. She wasn't anything but just very pure, kind, gentle, peaceful individual. Absolutely beautiful, both physically and spiritually. When you go to Thailand, you see all the people in the market who are shouting and screaming and all a part of the matrix. But every now and then, if you go to one of the local places that isn't a tourist trap, and you find one of these people, you see how very peaceful and how quiet they are within themselves. They're very easy to be around. Unlike the people in the Matrix who are struggling with the game of good versus evil, they're very difficult to be around because of their ego. Their ego is always trying to manipulate to be a way that they want to see you as opposed to what you really are. That's why the Buddhists came up with the expression, you are really three people. You are what you think you are what other people think you are, and you are what you really are. And finding that last one takes a lot of discipline to get to understand that. However, discipline to a lot of people seems to be something that people shun when they don't realize that actually discipline doesn't make life more difficult. It makes it easier because you simplify everything. You're in more control of yourself. And of course, I'm talking about the self-discipline that comes within and not the discipline that comes from other people with an agenda. If you allow the matrix to control your life becomes very confusing, distorted, and troubling. And on I could go. The last thing I'd like to point out before closing the subject is what is known as Kanno Renshu. I learned this from martial arts, which really originated from some of the Buddhist teachings. Kanno Renshu really means to be able to pick up things that are very difficult to see. It's how I learned to see people's auras, or to feel them, really. The Zen meditation, the martial arts, all of that kind of training allowed me to pick up very subtle nuances from people that allowed me to see immediately into their psyche. And beyond that, such as ghosts and other things. It's called reikonshyoi in Japanese, which means to be very intuitive, to the point where you can see spirits from the other side. Well, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please let me know. And thanks again for watching.